mic on it, it'll just pick up your audio.
Do I just put it like that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, we'll be playing past the thing.
The slideshow's playing.
Yeah,
Okay. I used to teach. I'm not scooping around. I mean, if you do it without any sound, you get into the auditorium.
You're okay? Ready to go? Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your patience while we were setting up there. I'd like to thank you for coming today. This is our first Disabled People's History Month event organised by Oxfordshire DPAC. We're a new branch of DPAC. We started in September 2025. However, as this event and recent campaigns show, we plan on being a very active branch. My name is Julie Battison, and I am the interim chair of Oxfordshire DPAC. Today we will be having Ellen Clifford and Teige Mathews-Palmer speak to you, and there will be question and answer sessions throughout the event. So first of all, if it's okay, I'd like to introduce Ellie and hand over the ropes.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's brilliant that we've got more new groups setting up, so I really wanted to come and meet you all and say how good it is to have you as part of the DPAC family. So I've been asked to talk about the history of disability activism within about 20 minutes, which is a struggle. I hope the way I've approached it is okay. So I put together a presentation, kind of starting with what I think are the key points for us to understand about disability activism before going on to talk through just a couple of specific examples. So slide one, please. I think there's one before that. Yeah, so I just thought to start with something specific to disability activism in Britain and to disabled people against cuts, and the way I understand and interpret the history of our activism. So disability activism in Britain is underpinned by the understanding that disability did not exist as a concept before the rise of capitalism, and that's explained very well in Roddy Slorak's book, A Very Capitalist Condition, and also is covered in mine. It's not an approach that all disabled activists globally follow, but it's really central to disability activism for as long as there's been a history of it in Britain. DPAC, as you'll probably be aware, is underpinned by the social model of disability, which I'm not going to go into detail on because of the time, but according to that, disability is a layer of oppression on top of the impairments, illnesses, conditions, or differences that we have that have resulted in us being marginalised, excluded, and having worse life chances. So for DPAC, everything we do is underpinned by an analysis that is based on the social model of disability. Yeah, so disabled people are a big group, the largest minority in the world, but we're divided by a wide variety of different illnesses, impairments, conditions, or non-normative bodies and or minds. So, for example, neurodivergence is a different wiring of the brain. It's not that there's something wrong with anyone, and there are very different ways of understanding all of the different things we could have or live with that mean that we identify as disabled people. And that can be a barrier at times to mobilising, because people have different experiences, different support needs, different access needs that can divide people. But what we have in common is our experience of that disabling oppression. That means that we don't have equal access to jobs, for example, that we might not have the support that we need to leave the house. That means we face discrimination and hostility, particularly in the current climate, where rhetoric is very much presenting disabled people, once again, as benefit cheats. Living under a system that puts profit before people means that disabled people rely on support from the state, essentially, to have life chances that are more similar to non-disabled people. So that's something that we, as a group, generally have in common. And our disabled identities tend to be the strongest when that support is not enough or under threat. Those are the points when, throughout our history, disabled people have identified on a pan-impairment basis and come together to campaign for improvements in our lives and to protect our rights. Next slide. Oh, sorry, that one, yeah. So there is also a difference between the experiences of people who acquire disability and people who are born disabled. Because of negative perceptions in society, people who acquire an impairment, become disabled during their lifetimes, can often see it very much as a personal tragedy. If, for example, you don't have friends who are disabled and who see it as a positive identity. And again, that can become a barrier to a collective identity. Those of us born disabled grow up having to fight for things everyone else takes for granted. And that means that quite often we're used to thinking outside of the box. We're also used to having to live more interdependently. We understand that people can rely on others for support and not see that as being a burden, not see that, that there's something wrong with us because we have to rely on others, but can actually see it as a positive, that we tend to live in a more collective, sharing way. Because of discrimination we face, disabled people are on the margins of society, but that can give us an outsider's perspective. We tend to have, I'd say, fewer illusions of the system we live under and of society. It's easier for us to see through empty rhetoric, easier for us to see how little the lives of the working class mean to those in power. And I think from bitter experience, we come to understand that we can't sit around waiting for someone above, someone in power above, to come and rescue us. Quite often, the only way we get our needs met is for us to fight for those. So that means that disabled people have, I'd say, a natural affinity with campaigning. And I think those are insights and skills that we grow up with that can be used very positively within disability activism. Although it is, of course, important to also remember, it doesn't naturally follow that someone who experiences disabling oppression will automatically become radical campaigners or see that as the way to effect change. Later on in the discussion, Michael, who's come with me, might want to say something from the perspective of Northern Ireland, which has a much less established tradition of radical activism among disabled people, and indeed there is continuing resistance from among disabled people themselves to approach influencing change from that perspective. So it doesn't naturally follow, but I do think that there are, like I say, experiences and skills that disabled people have from our experiences in life that mean that we can be very strong campaigners. And that is in contrast to the way that society tends to see us. tends to see us as passive victims, as objects of pity. Whether we're so minded to recognise it or not, though, I would say it's a truth that, that our very existence, our ability to exist as disabled people under existing socio-economic conditions poses a very direct threat to capitalism. I think it gives the lie to myths that uphold capitalism. I think it poses a threat, well, I know it poses a threat to the ability to force the working class into wage labour. When the welfare state was set up, Beveridge, when the plan was being drawn up by Beveridge, he deliberately didn't include payments to disabled people, disability payments, because he thought that the whip of starvation was needed to keep the working class working, and that if there were disability benefits available, it would encourage what he called malingering. And that's, of course, an attitude that is very prevalent today. It's never gone away. The fear seems to be that if members of the working class have a way out of bad jobs, out of poor pay, through identifying as disabled people, then there won't be enough workers to serve the interests of profit. Disability presents a threat to the narrative of individualism that upholds capitalism. It gives the lie to myths, such as that the government always, in their words, protect the most vulnerable, because actually the truth of many of their policies is that it's those who require the most support who are hardest hit. And it gives the lie to the myth that humans are naturally selfish, because that's not something that we often experience within our own lives, where we're living more interdependently. The only reason that support for disabled people exists under a system that puts profit before people, so that's support for people who may never be able to work within our lifetimes. The only reason that exists is not part of, what they call the social wage, part of, education or pensions, provision of a health service. They all keep the working class healthy and skilled and with a reason to work. But for those of us who are never going to work, then essentially the only reason that support exists is because the working class care about each other. And if you didn't have that support, there would be a level of unrest, because we value attributes other than those that capital requires to fulfill their own interests. So disability does have the potential to cause significant unrest because of the lie that so-called civilized societies protect the most vulnerable. That means that we do have the ability to win widespread public support when we can expose to the public that that's not happening, that specific laws and policies are doing the opposite of that, or failing to protect those who are most vulnerable. And in those situations, our history shows us that we can force concessions. We've seen that throughout the period since 2010, when welfare reform and austerity was introduced that disproportionately hit disabled people. We haven't ever changed the direction of travel that successive governments have gone in, but there have been moments when we've achieved significant U-turns and when we've halted their plans and caused real problems for them. So because of the threat that the existence of disabled people poses, mainstream ideas about disability that serve the interests of maintaining the status quo present us as victims and objects of pity who need other people to look after us, and tend to deny our own agency and ignore our voices. And as a result of that, the history of disability activism is something that tends not to be well known in wider society. There's been a few examples of, for example, exhibitions put on in museums in London that supposedly cover civil rights and protest history, and they always leave disability out because we're not sort of included within the mainstream understanding of those struggles. And that means that it's really important that we pass that knowledge to each other that shows that we do have agency and we are powerful and we can achieve wins. The other thing we also see is history being rewritten that deliberately leaves us out on the role that we've played. Just for example, with the special inquiry that DPAC triggered under the United Nations Convention that found the government guilty of grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights. That was triggered by a lot of hard work by the co-founders of DPAC, but I've been to presentations by academics that don't know that leave that kind of key bit out. I don't know where they think it came from. So that's why it's really important to write down our own history, which was one of the key intentions behind my book. So I'm now going to move on just to a couple of examples. Is that okay? Yeah. So the Blind March. So this was organised by the National League of the Blind in 1920. The aim was to secure government support to ensure blind people weren't condemned to poverty, because at the time many blind people depended on employment in workshops that were run by charities where the conditions were poor and wages were low. Blind men from all over the UK set off in three groups from Manchester, Leeds and Newport, and they marched on London, holding meetings in the towns and cities along the way to draw attention to their issues. And when they arrived in London on the 25th of April 1920, they were greeted at a rally in Trafalgar Square that was attended by around 10,000 people. And 5 days later, they got to meet the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. And the impact that had is it achieved the Blind Persons Act, which placed a duty on local authority to promote the welfare of blind people. They coined the slogan, "Justice, not charity," which we still use today. Sometimes it gets changed to "Rights, not charity." I prefer "Justice, not charity." So they had a very direct impact on the approaches, the politics of the disabled people's movement. And they actually inspired the more famous Jarrow Crusade in 1936, which a lot of people know about, but they don't know that it was inspired by disabled people. Next one, please. So this was the founding of the first Centre for Independent Living in the University of California, Berkeley campus, and that was 1972. And that's a picture at the top of Ed Roberts, who was a member of a group of disabled activists at the university from the late 1960s onwards, who called themselves the Rolling Quads. They had links to and support from the Black Panthers, and they campaigned for physically disabled students to have the same chances to live and study on the campus as other students. And Ed is seen as the father of the independent living movement. They set up their own centre for independent living, which provided peer-run services such as counselling, support to access personal assistance, and they campaigned for the environment on the campus to be accessible with things like dropped curbs. And that had a big impact. It led to the network of centres for independent living across the US, but also in Britain and the Scandinavian countries in particular. And really, it fundamentally changed society's approach to disability, emphasising that disabled people are actually experts in our own needs, and that services and policies that affect us are better when we have input into them. It moved away from the medical model of disability and the idea of curing people to the belief that if a disabled person needs support, then that should be provided. It paved the way in the US for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990. And in England, it inspired a campaign group that was set up in the early 70s called the Union Against the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPS, and led to the development of the social model of disability. The photo on the bottom is Brad Lomax, who was a member of the Black Panthers, who worked with Ed to co-found a centre for independent living in Oakland to particularly provide services to members of the black community. So, next one, please. So, the Bolivian Disabled Campaign is a 1,000-mile march from Trinidad to La Paz. This was 2011 to 2012. And they were fighting for a disability benefit because there wasn't one before in Bolivia. There wasn't enough support for disabled people not to live in poverty or not to live dependent on family members who were often poor and on low wages themselves. So in November 2011, a group of about 50 disabled people, including children, began a 1,000-mile march from Trinidad in Bolivia to the capital, La Paz. When they arrived in La Paz on the 23rd of February, the police used pepper spray and tasers on the marchers who tried to break through the lines using their crutches and wheelchairs. And several people were injured and 4 were arrested. And the marchers then settled into camps on the streets, occupying areas of La Paz, and 10 of them began a hunger strike. And after 8 days on the hunger strike, the president, who was then Evo Morales, who liked to present himself as a reforming president who cared about equalities, he agreed to concessions to the protesters, including a disability rights law, a disability benefit, and the whole thing also raised awareness among the public in Bolivia of what disabled people were going through. The disability benefit wasn't paid at a rate high enough to essentially move disabled people out of poverty. So in 2016 to 17, disabled campaigners came back out onto the streets, initially in Cochabamba, but when their protest there failed, they did another march. That one was only 380 kilometres across the Andes. The journey took about over a month. Once they were in La Paz, they organised regular demonstrations, including, I don't know if you can make it out in the bottom picture, there's people in wheelchairs being suspended by ropes from bridges. I know a couple of the activists who led that, and it was difficult because members of the campaign group did die through what they were doing, but those people thought they had nothing to live for anyway. The police responded to them with water cannons and tear gas, but the adverse publicity did in the end force the government to concede to an increase. So DPAC has probably most respect for the Bolivian campaigners, and it's a real honour to know some of them. Last one, please. This is the last one. So to end with, the Anti-Atos Games, organised by DPAC and UK Young Cup plus allies in the summer of 2012. We organised that to coincide with the Paralympic Games, which were being sponsored by Atos, which was a great opportunity for us. It allowed us to raise awareness of the injustice and harm that was being meted out through the work capability assessment that had only fairly recently been introduced. That was rolled out by the coalition government from 2010 onwards. We were finding that our voices weren't being heard in terms of the harm, the suicides, the deaths that we already saw coming from the WCA, which was a very flawed protest. So we used that opportunity to hold a week of protests and actions, managed to work with a few documentary makers who did exposés that were on TV that week, and on the final day, disabled activists, including Pat here, occupied the lobby of the Department for Work and Pensions in Caxton House in London. I was at Triton Square, which was where Atos's HQ was. We ended up having hundreds of protesters there, which we didn't actually expect. And then my job was to lead them to join up with the people inside Caxton House once we knew that they'd managed to secure the occupation. And the occupiers emerged cheering crowds, and that made it onto primetime news that evening. So that's the photo at the bottom. So Pat acted as a buddy to Roger Lewis here, who was a blind friend who was, you know, who's a real stalwart in DPAC, and he's much missed because he's no longer with us, and that's quite a special photo. But the impact went from the public not basically knowing who ATOS were or what the WCA was, to like by the end of that week, the public consciousness really, you could see it changing. ATOS developed a very toxic reputation that in the end led them to running away from the contract with the WCA. And yes, it was just taken over by another private company, Maximus. But what has never materialised is a flourishing private sector market for welfare assessments, which is what the architect of welfare reform, Lord Freud, that's what he envisaged, and that's what he intended to establish. And we stopped him from doing that. I think people have described the government's relationship with the the continuing contractors who carry out the assessments as being chained to a corpse. I think Rick from Manchester DPAC described it as. Because nobody wants to take them on, the government is chained to using companies who don't deliver. And in Scotland, they've actually taken the PIP assessments, well, they've got an adult disability payment instead of PIP, and they've taken that back in-house. So it's going to be very interesting to see if that makes a difference to the quality in disabled people's experiences, and means we can very much still campaign for assessments to be taken back in-house to give more accountability and transparency. Here, we also managed to raise awareness among the general public that welfare reform wasn't just about fixing a broken system where, you know, it's all about fraud and benefit cheats, that actually there was a very dark side to what was happening with welfare reform, and that was really what that week achieved. So that's the last one. There's so many more moments that, you know, that I think are really special, but yeah, save those for another day. Thank you.
Hiya. We're going to open the floor up now for some questions for about 10-15 minutes. I'm not sure if we need to walk around giving this to people.
I think they'll pick up.
Okay.
Tell me in a second. Test.
Has anybody got a question for Ellen? This lady at the front, I don't know her name.
Hi.
You okay?
Can you hear me all right? So, what's happening at the moment with the work capability assessment possibly being taken out entirely of the ESA and JSA situation? So do we know, because they're not doing a white paper, didn't do a white paper this autumn now, do we know whether they're going to go ahead and create this unemployment insurance benefit, which will mean that there won't be a work capability assessment and they'll just have a flat rate for everybody, whether it's JSA or ESA? Do we know anything about that? So, sorry.
It's all right. I'll just move around with them. I'll move around.
Yeah.
So if you're taking question and answers,
Yeah.
I'll move around with them.
Okay.
They're good for about 3 feet.
Right.
No, basically. I think it was a victory that they've scrapped the white paper. I think partly I wonder if it was because the way they tried to justify the cuts and the changes was on the idea of getting more people into employment, and they said that in October they would publish the figures for how many people their cuts and changes would move into employment as a result, and we know from previous things like the proposed changes to the work capability assessment by the last government, the percentages are always tiny. So that would have really embarrassed them, as well as, you know, what all of us did to fight them. And we basically don't know. Everything seems to be paused while the TIMS review goes ahead. No, I feel exactly the same way about the TIMS review. Yeah. Which is only personal independence payment anyway. I don't know. I think we're going to have to wait until they put out more announcements about that. But I think that we can, you know, if we see opportunities to continue to put pressure on and make them think that any more cuts, which essentially is what that will be, that policy you're talking about will mean a big cut for people. So.
Well, they're going to time limit ESA as well as JSA. So that will mean, what happens to people who are already on ESA, which is contributions based and not time limited at the moment, and it's not means test. So if they merge it with JSA, at the moment you only get 6 months JSA. So what happens to people like me that have been on it for 2 years? Will we go off a cliff edge when they create the unemployment insurance benefit, or will legacy payments continue and then the new people face a situation where they get a flat rate like JSA, but it's only for 6? But in the consultation they asked us whether we wanted it for 6 months or a year, but they didn't say all permanent. I don't think.
No, all those questions still exist, and we don't have answers.
That wasn't limited to, that was going to be in primary legislation. So when it wasn't in the PIP and the Universal Credit Bill in the first white paper from the Green Paper, it was expected to be this autumn in a second white paper, but then Pat took over and said they weren't going to do a white paper. So is it hidden somewhere in the budget? That's what I'm worried about.
I don't think those changes are hidden in the budget, although I know that John Pring from Disability News Service is looking into where they have attributed savings in the autumn budget to welfare reform. What is that about? I suspect it might be about the fact that they are going to start doing work capability assessments again, so reviews for existing claimants, and they're going to increase frequency of PIP assessments. There are things that they can do without bringing in primary legislation, because I think those are the points that they realise are potentially difficult, where there'll be unrest. So I think they're very much looking for ways that they can bring in cuts through the back door. But the things that you've raised, I'm not aware of any policy or legislative announcements.
Like you did for the PIP 4.0. But how do we campaign when we don't know when they're going to try and put it in?
They can't put it in without announcing it somewhere like a white paper. So we're waiting to see. I don't think they know what they're doing. Well, we know they didn't. Okay, we know they don't know. We know they don't know what they're doing. The UC and PIP bill came from number 10. It wasn't, I mean, you know, I don't want to say good things about Liz Kendall, but it didn't come from her. She didn't want it. It was the little boys in number 10 who tried to push that one through. So there's just a lot of incompetence on top of the conscious cruelty, and people are scared and people don't know what to expect. I think also, you know, Starmer hopefully is on his way out, so things could be very different if that happens. But it is, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty.
You got a question, Pat?
Well, just a few comments because I'm thinking we're going to have to write around the specifics. You know what I mean? When we kind of know them, but I think the government is incredibly weak, and you're right. I think Starmer's on the way out, and I think that obviously with the U-turn around the winter fuel allowance, but also a huge U-turn over the massive pit cuts that they want to drive through. Now they did get away with the cuts to the health element of university credit, they're huge. But I think the thing for me for DPAC, over that period of, you know, when you set up just after the Tories got in at their conference, where they were going to push through all these measures of austerity that seem like a heat-seeking missile that targeted disabled people, right? Massively, and that's just. Anyone that thought had any kind of respite from that for a Labour government? No, not at all. Watching the policy show this morning, you've got them talking about, these people. Do you know what I mean? We need to kind of reduce the number of people that are on kind of, that are getting kind of extra because they've got mental health problems, stuff, and we need to deal with that, right? It's unsustainable. That's what they say, isn't it, right? No one says. Do you know what I mean? £13 billion on nuclear missiles. That's unsustainable. No one says that. No one says, the richest people on the planet, the billionaires, hardly paying tax. No one says that's unsustainable. And I think the thing about DPAC, I see some of the fantastic action, incredibly militant. Do you know what I mean? And actually, it does kind of completely overturn, turn upside down, what Ellen was talking about in terms of, the view of disabled people, that you can treat them like that. What you saw in terms of DPAC was a militancy that said, we're going to fight. That day that we occupied, we had the demonstration at ATOS, headquarters down the road from DWP headquarters. We occupied it, a number of us occupied it, and then there was a whole number of people outside it. And it was the first time, I think, that because the state used to, if you block some roads and stuff like that, they were a little bit kind of worried about, we don't want to kind of ruin people like that. They went in with batons. I remember there was disabled people that had their arms broken, their wheelchairs broken. They kind of let off the leash. But people are up for a fight. We're going to have to fight. But also, we need to also kind of link it to all the other things, all the other kind of fights that are going on as well. I think it's going to be important. I thought it was interesting the history of the Barclay thing. Barclay had a great history in terms of a fight back over Vietnam. But the link with the Black Panthers, do you know what I mean? We need to make all those links as well to make it absolutely clear.
I think we have to challenge the basic idea that they're putting across, that the welfare budget is ballooning, because it isn't ballooning.
No, it isn't.
If you look at it instead of terms of pounds each year, if you just look at it as a terms of proportion of GDP, the total welfare bill was being 11% for 30 odd years, and it's still going to be 11% predicted until 2030. The disabled portion of that is been 1%. So I don't know how long, and it will be 1%. It's going to be. So we've got to challenge the figures when they say that the incidence of disability is twice the rate of the incidence of people asking for disability benefits is twice the rate of the incidence in the increase in the population. What they're saying is, if you look at, there's 3.7 million on the PIP, but 1.8 million migrated across from DLA. And the same thing with ESA going on to universal credit, not I don't know how to say that. So the doubling is because of the migration. It's not because there were more people asking for it than are turning up suddenly disabled.
There's lots
so we've
of...
got to challenge the figures.
Yes.
I think.
Yes, and we were.
Now for it is
well, we have been.
And it's been put in by the IFS and what's the one that's the Crown Prosecution Service? I'm dyslexic, so I get mixed up. The Centre for Policy Studies. Both of those two have been putting out these false figures about disabled increases that just
Yeah.
aren't there. We've
So-
got to challenge them because they're in the green paper, their figures.
Yeah, no, we have been continuously. The issue is that journalists and commentators don't pay attention, and they don't challenge or question when politicians repeat these lies about the welfare budget ballooning, although there was a point at which I think they did, in the fight against the UC and PIP bill, the people defending the cuts did stop talking about it ballooning and started just talking specifically about disability, the amount spent on disability benefits. And that's because, you know, we'd done enough to kind of make them realise that they couldn't keep doing that one. But it started to come out again, and they've started to use it again. So I think one thing we can do while we're waiting to see, you know, what policy or legislation might be announced is spreading awareness of the myths. And, you know, the reality of it. The other thing was the state pension age increased. So, of course, you're going to get more. But they've done this since 2010. It's all been lies and spin, and the DWP is really, really well rehearsed in doing that now.
Also, how do they afford it in all the other countries in Europe? We're sort of middle of the road on disability.
Yeah. So,
Bottom of the road for that is disability pay.
yeah. So can I ask Teige for the final question of this session, and then Ellen, if you want to sum up, and then we'll have a 10-15 minute break. Teige?
Yeah, thanks Ellen, and everyone, really stimulating and really important to hear about. What Pat was saying about, and the discussion was following on about how pervasive these ways of talking about disabled people are, as if people's everyday lives are something that are unsustainable for the system. It's something that has to be cast aside for the system to carry on. But we don't talk about the fact that, you know, we really need to try and get behind this campaign and grow it and get a voice out there. And so the thing that's unsustainable is like the fact that 50 families in Britain hold more wealth than the bottom half of the whole UK population right now. But that gulf has widened so much, that's what's unsustainable. There was an article a few weeks back about SEND education provision in Oxfordshire, about how specialist provisions are going to be cut and children are going to be moved into mainline schools. Now, you know, in an ideal world where we were trying to provide for people's needs and have all the adaptations and an inclusive environment in non-segregated schools, I'd be all for that. But that's not what it means. And all the language in the article was about the deficit, was the amount of money versus some target of zero, you know. It was about quantifying the resources for these children to have a schooling, to have a childhood, because their parents have to go to work every day, or whatever, you know, they can't be caring for them. None of us really get to care for our kids all day long, and your children have to go into some sort of care. And it's disgusting to have the BBC present that without any critical interpretation whatsoever as being a deficit that's causing a crisis in the system. That's people's need to live in this world and to be a part of society.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to sum up?
Yeah. Yeah, it has become increasingly acceptable to talk about us as a burden on the economy. That's part of the kind of the ramping up of the hostility towards us. And it is very upsetting. But I think so long as we live under a system that puts profit before people, essentially disabled people, we're always going to have to struggle for the support and resources that we need to survive and to have more equal life chances. If there's like economic boom, then we will get concessions. But as soon as there's a recession, we're the first and the hardest that are going to be hit, and we'll be scapegoated. Like they're scapegoating migrants and asylum seekers. Disabled people also get scapegoated to distract from the fact that, you know, where's the money going? It's going to the super rich. The outlook now is continued recession, so it's really important, I think, that we collectivise, that we unite among ourselves to pass our histories down and stay radical, but also, like Pat said, to join up with the other, you know, campaigns, particularly, I think that the far right poses a big threat. It's very interesting if you look at the way Reform votes in terms and the things that they say on welfare issues, because they know that they count on manipulating the working class to get votes and get support. So it isn't always immediately apparent to disabled people what Farage and Reform think about disabled people and the fact that they do see us as parasites on the system. They play that one quite carefully, and so another job that I think we have to do as well as, is to counter the idea that they provide a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for a brilliant first session. Can we return back around 22? So for about 15 minutes? Yeah. Yep. Is that okay?
Oh, I don't need. Oh, I forgot to give you this.
Oh, it's okay.
Do you want to do the second session? Share the second session?
Easy either.
Because I think if you could actually,
Okay.
because I asked Jack because I didn't know whether you would. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, ask him, and if you don't want to do it, I'll do it. Yeah.
Can't do Facebook, you need so many subscribers and you have to be on it so long to be qualified. But to YouTube, you get 24 hours. So I can do like say there as well to add to it maybe. No, we did get it in. With what plans? I bring it back to you and said, physically, and it was like that last bit of connect to YouTube, do the streaming, and it's like probably all these questions. I'm just like, well done, you. Yeah, remarkable. Sweaty, that software is brilliant. Spring. What's it called? Open broadcast. Wow. So, still image is now projecting onto the. Yeah. So, that's music. Your input community. So, no, the only thing that's going on here is I've been to it twice now. 8 months the first time, a year. 3 people at least. It will be on YouTube. So I understand why people think
Teige, with this, you're speaking now. Yeah, you don't need to wear this. You can leave it on the no, you can get a better pick of your people are speaking. Yeah. Yeah, okay, I won't put it on the books then. Just.
don't bother pay for the car, you don't get any money for that anymore. And you can have a scooter, or you can be electric scooter, or you can have a car, you can't have both. You have to buy your own electric scooter to then go in the car. If you get a car, things like that. You only renting it for 3 years, you're not buying it. No. I think there's a real misconception about mobility out there at the moment. You have to pay for the hoist as well to get it. I've got a vintage type thing. You have to pay to have a hoist put into those goods stuff, which you don't have to pay next in 3 months, 3 years time to get it again. So it's quite complicated with that. My daughter's got special educational needs, like I have, but I didn't watch any of this help for a lot longer. So I got religion too, which is why I need it now. I didn't last for 3 years, but it's been sort of like she was saying, that you have to come to terms with not being at work all the time. The loss of your independence. It's almost like a bereavement. Being disabled to be very active before and getting used to it. So coming to then go through all the fit business, an ESA, like going through what they call the secondary ESA as well. At the same time, it was very traumatic. On top of the middle of a pandemic.
I love.
I am probably quite lucky.
So the theme from the slide didn't go, you went to there, but also went straight to
It did, yeah.
can resize.
Yeah.
Wow. So like at the moment,
Probably hypertension, which is like a life limiting disease. They told us she'd only have
It's
5
three
years.
months back.
Probably at 7 now.
yeah.
She had to go to a
Thing is, afterwards we can download
5
it,
years
put out
or
this
so. So, yeah, a lot of people have to do that. You got more
he has to chat for it, isn't it? I got my chat over here, it's on YouTube, on yeah, sure.
She really needs to go on as well. It's not
And it shows when she showed me because they're used to regularly every day. Things like that. I got to look over when you get those virtual lives. Everything's got to be help. Someone's better than you always put down your work day when you want to get it. You put down, oh, some days I can go out and do it. And then yeah. By having what I've said on the form to talk to you about the assessment.
Right, Ian said it works well on the table, actually.
Oh, right, okay, excellent.
We'll see if he still says so. Just say a few words. Yeah, how's that? Is that okay?
Yep, yep. Welcome back, everybody. Before we carry on with the second part, there is a sign-up sheet going round, so if you haven't signed it already, please feel free to do so. And also, we've got 3 wonderful books that you can come and have a look at the end if you want to have a look at them. I highly recommend them to everybody. And buy them, sorry, yes, sorry, and buy them. So, this session, Teige is going to be having a chat with us about resisting the far right, a warning from history, disability, eugenic and the Nazis. And Teige is very active in the local DPAC and a We Demand Change activist.
Thanks a lot, Julie. So my name's Teige. I'm an activist. No worries, people find it hard to pronounce my name. It rhymes with Craig. I'm Teige. I'm local to Oxford, and I hope I can do a decent job of opening up a discussion. I hope we'll get to a discussion. We invited Roddy Slorak to be here, the author of A Very Capitalist Condition, And what I'm going to talk about draws heavily from chapter 7 of this book and an article that Roddy has written in the International Socialist Journal. So I will do my best to adequately present the material. I'm an activist also in Stand Up to Racism, and I'm very concerned with the rise of the far right and fascism. Now, we're going to talk about eugenics, which has kind of been forever linked to the Nazi Holocaust in the minds of most. But one thing I want to draw out as we go through a history is that eugenics had a lot of prestige and popularity across the political spectrum at the turn of the 20th century. So I want to take us through a short history of eugenics and scientific racism, and eugenics as it pertained to particularly women and disabled people, and towards the poor and working class as it was. In the end, we're going to have to come back and discuss the assumptions that run through it. You know, are the assumptions that underlie eugenics still here today? What are the risks of a resurgence of eugenic practices, not just thinking, and the rise of scientific racism today? And we need to have a discussion about how ordinary people and campaigns like DPAC and Stand Up to Racism and We Demand Change and so on are going to be part of preventing that future and building a better future. Okay, so we'll get into the history. So eugenic ideas developed first in Britain, the United States and Germany, and they were taken up by a very diverse range of governments. Women, people with learning difficulties and other disabled people were the principal victims, and then it went on to play a key role in legitimising scientific racism. So the term eugenics was introduced in 1883 by Francis Galton, who was a famous British scientist, and he was the younger cousin of Charles Darwin. The word eugenics derives from Greek, and it means something like well-born. So at that time, Charles Darwin's work, The Origin of Species, was really influential of this idea that natural selection, survival of the fittest, was the primary mechanism by which living things changed and evolved and developed traits. But Galton was particularly interested on one part of that work, which focused on domesticating animals and trying to change the traits of animals by selective breeding. In Galton's view, the same methods of selective breeding, of engineering and interfering with reproduction, if they were used on humans, might introduce, he says, prophets and high priests of civilization into the world, as surely as we can propagate idiots by mating cretins, in his words. This was in the context of an elite concern with Malthus's idea that population growth was sure to outstrip food supply, and this would lead to famine and wars. I mean, we now live in a world of 8 billion people, I'd like to point out, where we produce many times more food than we need for those people, but because of problems in how it's distributed in the interest of profit, you know, a massive proportion of it goes to waste, and we still have famines today. So the theologian and economist Malthus is quite outdated, his ideas, but they were popular at the time and a great concern for elites. So Galton, Francis Galton, argued for financial incentives to promote marriage between healthy and mentally strong families, in line with his conviction that superior members of society ought to be encouraged to have more children. You still see this today in some ideas that well-to-do families need to have, you know, yet more kids and yet more kids and yet more kids. And this became known as positive eugenics. On the other hand, negative eugenics is interested in limiting the, quote, overbreeding among the poor or the underclass. The British Eugenics Education Society was founded in 1907 and was led by Charles Darwin's son, Leonard Darwin. And that society promoted this view of negative eugenics leading up to the First World War. And there was a preference for negative eugenics in that time among eugenicists all around the world. There was really a focus on this idea of limiting the breeding of undesirables. So in July 1912, over 800 people attended the first International Eugenics Congress, and this was held at the Imperial Institute in South Kensington in London. Leonard Darwin presided, and Arthur Balfour gave the main address. A year later, the UK Parliament passed the Mental Deficiency Act, which authorised taking the illegitimate children of paupers into care and the removal of so-called feeble-minded school children, using IQ tests to measure that, away to special schools. In 1913, Leonard Darwin gave a presidential address in which he emphasised that large sums of money were being wasted on services which would be much less needed if the unfit were eliminated. Those were his words. Such concerns were already being turned into policies in the United States, and they would later be implemented famously on a very large and horrific scale in Hitler's Germany. So in the United States, throughout much of the 20th century, compulsory sterilisation was seen as the best way to dispose of undesirables. And this was targeted at newly emancipated black people, Jewish people, and other races, as well as the poor, infirm, and disabled. There were 27 US states that passed compulsory sterilisation laws, mainly affecting, quote, criminals, idiots, rapists, and imbeciles. Up to 1963, over 64,000 people were forcibly sterilised, and most of them were women. In California, the figures show that these women were disproportionately of Mexican descent, and their official diagnoses included terms like being oversexed, sexually wayward, having abnormally large parts of their genitals. Other laws were enforcing segregation or marriage restrictions. By 1935, eugenic societies existed in more than 40 countries, and in many instances eugenics was state policy, so it was massively popular. Nazi eugenics transformed all debate on the issue after the revelations of what occurred in the Holocaust. Beginning 6 months after Hitler took power in 1933, a new programme authorised compulsory sterilisation of around 350,000 people with a range of supposedly heritable conditions. Hitler later extended the powers of doctors so those deemed unworthy of life could be granted a mercy death, in their words. The T4 programme involved the murder of at least 275,000 disabled people, and the T4 programme appears to have been really where the gas chambers were figured out and innovated, and they were developed first on disabled people. They would later obviously be used in the concentration camps against 10 million people in all, Jews, Roma, socialists, gays, and so on. The careers of doctors who participated in the killing in the T4 programme were, in many cases, unaffected. After the fact, there was no compensation ever paid and no retributions ever made. We should say, though, that around the world, not all eugenicists were racists or Nazis. This was it had broad appeal. So other eugenicists promoted social reforms in healthcare, housing, and education, and they didn't identify anyone's innate ability with their class or their race. However, even though some of these reform eugenicists blamed social causes instead of inferior genes, they still shared a concern with improving the poor biological qualities of individuals, and they were very much focused on their task being to improve the biological qualities of individuals, not the societies that individuals grow up in. The Scandinavian countries are seen as progressive due to the welfare states they set up in the 30s. The same social democratic parties responsible for those reforms also introduced laws authorising compulsory sterilisation of thousands of people, classed as feeble-minded or mentally retarded. So from 1935 to 1975, Sweden sterilised more of its population in absolute numbers and relative terms than any country apart from Nazi Germany. So these ideas of eugenics actually went hand in hand with the establishment of welfare states and other social reforms in many instances. So I wanted to just take us through a quick aside to talk about the pseudoscientific idea here, the preoccupation with heredity, or the idea that eugenics could achieve anything. So when eugenics was being popularized, the science of genetics was very young, and eugenics and genetics were broadly seen as being part of the same science. They weren't really distinguished at all. Scientists in Darwin and Galton's time didn't understand how traits were inherited from one generation to the next. They had very crude theories. Darwin argued himself in Origin of the Species that children were the average of their ancestors, produced through the mixing of their parents' blood. And now there were experiments done where blood transfusions were used to prove that blood mixing had no impact at all on heredity. Genetics were established by the Augustinian monk Gregor Mendel, who studied pea plants, and he developed the relatively simple laws of how a plant could be a certain colour or a certain height or whatever. However, modern biology distinguishes between genotype, the set of genes you've got inside your cells, and phenotype, what you look like or how you behave or whatever. So phenotypes can come about due to your genes. Obviously, you inherit genes and they go together to determine some process you develop from an embryo and a child and so on. However, there's often confusion about where traits come from. Here's even quite a trivial example. The colour of a flamingo is not encoded anywhere in its genotype. Okay, it's actually the food that flamingos eat that turns their feathers white or pink. Similarly, conceptions about human height. Human height is often thought of to be quite simple. It's got so much more to do with the nutrition and the environment available. Scientists understand now that most human traits that are of interest to us are not genetically determined in any simple way. There are hundreds or thousands of genes involved, as well as environmental inputs, even during embryonic development. And then there's your life history and your life experiences. So, nonetheless, there's been a long history of talking about how intelligence is inherited. And the belief that intelligence is hereditary is central to eugenics. Psychologists in Harvard transformed Alfred Binet's diagnostic tool into the IQ test. And the IQ test has a long history of being used to measure intelligence in a very simple way. In fact, the term moron was coined to describe people with the lowest scores on the IQ test. Of 1.75 million US Army war draftees who were assessed in 1916, 30% were classified as morons. I don't know how much use that test is, really. But they quickly came under very valid criticism that the questions in the test were based around your cultural understanding. So they had a massive bias towards your class. There are questions in there about violins and so on. You haven't come across one of those. Massive biases towards your race. Nonetheless, they became $1 million industry used all over the place to assess students and workers. In Britain, in 1921, the psychologist and eugenicist Cyril Burt claimed to have turned the IQ test into a recognised instrument of scientific precision. He claimed that IQ differences were inherited and that British national intelligence was declining. This was used politically to restructure the education system at the time. So he created the 11+ examination, and that guaranteed the segregation of working class children into inferior schools from where they could virtually never ascend to universities. It took a long time, from 1921 until 1974, that Leon Kamin exposed Burt's research, went and looked through the records of the research he had conducted, found twins that didn't exist, found results that had never been collected, and found out that Cyril Burt's wonderful research that had set up the schooling system in Britain was a fraud, was a complete fraud. You know, he had this conviction that intelligence was innate, and he would fake it to prove it. Of course, this is a brutal pessimism that regards a child's IQ score as fixed. It's a fixed measure of their ability in their life. And that, of course, that will help to ensure that he or she remains fixed with some, you know, some ceiling in their life chances. The influential Colchester study by British biologist Lionel Penrose, this was in 1938, confirmed that some conditions were hereditary, some medical conditions, some health conditions were inherited, some of them inherited in different ways, but also showed that environmental influences extended to the developing embryo, and that definitions of mental illness and crime were used interchangeably. And his arguments were very damaging to the reputation of eugenics. He said, crime and mental disorder were very often regarded in popular culture as one and the same, especially among the poor. Penrose was the first to point out that the overlapping of the two criteria was a result of class prejudice, not a clinical definition. Penrose also noted how concepts of degeneracy were class-based. In the upper classes, poverty is sometimes regarded as evidence of degeneracy. But similarly, he argued, the poor can complain of the degenerate, idle, and dissolute behaviour of the rich, who rejects out of hand the legal grades of mental deficiency as being scientifically worthless. So completely wrecking the sort of scientific credibility of eugenics. But as Penrose was carrying out his research, the notion that separate races of humans can be distinguished genetically was beginning to be challenged. And modern biology has shown that these ideas that races are genetically separate, that their attributes are genetically separate, has shown that they're not based on science, they're just based on prejudice. In fact, genetics has shown that around 8/10 of all the genetic diversity in humans comes from differences among the people arising from living in the same country, or what you might call English people, say, for instance. 8/10 of all the diversity of humans exists among those people. The overall genetic differences between what people describe as races, they're really no greater than the differences between neighbouring countries in any part of the world. So this idea of the races is a pseudoscientific idea. Back to Francis Galton on racism. We're going to talk about racism just for a little bit. Galton complained that there was unreasonable sentiment against the gradual extinction of an inferior race. Absolutely shocking language. He thought it was unreasonable to object to the idea that you could gradually, you know, not perhaps violently in one day, but gradually extinguish an inferior race. Absolutely disgusting idea. But his belief in the superiority of Britain's rulers was widely shared among the middle class, and his desire to halt the reproduction of genetically unfit. There was a time when this was popular. Anti-Jewish racism led to Britain's first anti-immigrant legislation, and that was the Aliens Act of 1905. The notion of scientific racism, classifying races and judging their value, began with French anatomists who were measuring skulls. And the papers written on this, again, were found to be totally fraudulent, or at least deeply flawed. They would find skulls and measure the volume of the skulls and make arguments around the intelligence of the races based on these examples of a few skulls. During the 1920s, to make the link, scientific racism is most closely associated with eugenics in the context of Germany and the US. So during the 1920s, there was a debate in Germany around Rassenhygiene, and this became a central tenet of the Nazi ideology. The Nazis pushed an ideology of race biology, that there was a hierarchy of races, and they were very much interested in the racial hygiene of the Aryan race. At the turn of the 20th century, the term race was used in much of colonial Europe and the US, but its scientific meaning was multiple, ambiguous, or contradictory. Nonetheless, race was accepted as a biological category, and theories were constructed around a hierarchy of races with Nordic peoples at the top. This was considered factual, free of prejudice. And as a consequence, there were racist assumptions in eugenics that weren't challenged at that time. American eugenics was led by the biologist Charles Davenport and was explicitly racist from the very start. So Davenport used new national institutions, the Eugenic Record Office and the Eugenic Research Association, to wield influence over the whole of the human biology field in the US. Data from IQ tests were used to convince US politicians that Slavs, Jews, Italians, and others were mentally dull, and that their dullness was racial or at least constitutional. And that gave a kind of white coat scientific respectability to the infamous 1924 Immigration Act. The extent to which this and other US laws influenced the Nazi state is clear, isn't it? In the early years of the Third Reich, several US eugenicists welcomed Hitler's plans, in fact, as a logical fulfillment of their own efforts. So eugenics and racism have become almost interchangeable terms. However, we can't allow it to be overlooked that even in Hitler's Germany, the majority of people forcibly sterilized or murdered on eugenic grounds weren't necessarily on a racial basis, but they were classed as being feeble-minded or useless eaters. This comes back to this idea that people are only, and this Malthusian idea that we can't afford to feed people unless they're of sufficient stock or unless you can buy their labour to go into your machines and your economy to drive it forward. And elsewhere, the victims of state-sponsored sterilisation were often women living in asylums, or they were people drawn from the poorest and most marginalised sections of society. So I should probably skip a couple sections and come to today, and I'll try and wrap this up so we can have a discussion. Just to say, quickly, in 2013, while Boris Johnson was the Mayor of London, he gave a lecture to city bankers where he said, "Whatever you may think of the value of IQ tests, it's surely relevant to a conversation about equality that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85, while about 2% have an IQ above 130. The harder you shake the pack, the easier it will be for some cornflakes to get to the top." And on becoming Prime Minister, Johnson recruited an advisor with equally horrible ideas. This is Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings argued in a government report that due to genetic factors, real talent is rare and mediocrity is ubiquitous. So this is eugenic opinion, alive and well, less than 10 years ago at the seat of government in Britain. And this is something we need to remain concerned about. The Conservative peer and editor of Spectator magazine, Toby Young, in 2019, he wrote a fawning puff piece about Johnson. This one's a bit silly, where he wrote, "His imposing physical build, his thick neck, and his broad Germanic forehead. There was also something of Nietzsche's Übermensch about him." I mean, frankly, just ridiculous. You won't be surprised then to find out that Toby Young was among attendees of secret eugenics conferences at University College London. You won't be surprised to know that he was there. And there was a pivotal role of UCL in the history of eugenics. This became public news when students and staff demanded an inquiry into it in 2018. This is because it was revealed that the university had been hosting secret conferences. These were so-called London Conference on Intelligence. Attendees, besides Toby Young, included the racist intelligence researcher Noah Carl, the psychologist Richard Lynn, infamous for the bell curve, and more. So there is alive and well today a strand of scientific racism that wants to revive the idea that actually it's scientifically correct. These are racist ideas are scientifically correct, and they explain things like criminality and poverty, violence against women and so on, that this is explained by racial differences among people. You know, they want to revive these ideas and say that there is a kind of establishment that's trying to shut down the facts. And actually, these are quite elite people who are putting themselves into academia and into publishing and getting together to have international conferences. It's something we need to be quite concerned about. We should say, if I can skip ahead to find it, that it wasn't just the scientific criticism of eugenics that will condemn it to the dustbin of history, because it's been thoroughly disgraced in the scientific field. Nonetheless, you can get people like Noah Carl getting prestigious fellowships at Oxford or Cambridge universities and so on. And if it weren't for the campaigns of student activists who got up and said, actually, we don't think these people have a right to teach racism from a privileged seat and be paid fellowship money to do it in our institute, if it weren't for them, they'd still be there peddling papers about how criminality and various sorts of crimes actually have a scientific racist basis.
We might not have time for questions.
Sorry, let's wrap up. So we need to be vigilant to it, don't we? Because even though it's lost its allure of scientific objectivity, there is a real risk of a revival of eugenics ideas, all the underlying assumptions there about not being able to afford people being classed as useless eaters and so on, and particularly the rise of racists like Steve Bannon internationally, who says, it's time to come out and say it loud and proud that, yes, we are racist and that's a badge of honour, they say. So let's remain vigilant about it and let's keep launching campaigns against it.
Open the floor up. Does anybody have any questions for Teige? I mean, I found it fascinating. I learnt all sorts.
Yeah, although eugenics has been scientifically discredited, the ideas behind it still very much influence society today. Like thinking about language that we use, like it's still acceptable to use language that disparages people on the basis of comparing them to disabled people. So like you're saying that, moron and cretin and idiot, there's also mental health language, like politicians are always calling each other loonies and things. And that kind of reinforces the idea that there's something wrong with disabled people, which is essentially linked to eugenics. It's definitely a threat today, particularly Trump told his nephew that he should let his very disabled son die, basically. So those ideas are still around, very much so. But I think I wanted to give the example like I mentioned to you, David, about I think that Action T4, I think it's important to remember that it was resistance from below that meant that they officially brought an end to the programme, hit the hat to say it had finished. the killing still continued. Doctors were still bunking people off. But they had to. I mean, partly it was because soldiers, like on the Eastern Front, were causing unrest because they'd heard that people who were injured were going back and being killed. And if you were in a war, you want your soldiers to fight. But there were also an example I love, which was a village called Augsburg, and they had like a centre, like an institution for people with learning disabilities there. And the people there used to go and do things. They interacted with the villagers and did their gardens for them and stuff. And when the grey buses came, the village like rose up and they sent the buses away without them on. And it's just a small example, but I just think it's beautiful, and it shows that we can, we can make a difference. So I just wanted to share that.
Any more questions? Yep.
I find that really interesting, really interesting. But because of my age, I was thinking of how currently some of these ideas were in the 70s. Because although Mrs. Thatcher came to be Prime Minister, it had been widely expected that the person who would run against Heath was Sir Keith Joseph. But by chance, just before the challenge to Thatcher, he made a speech about the need to reduce the births to people from social classes 4 and 5. And this, it was said, made him somebody the British electorate might have trouble electing as a Prime Minister. So Thatcher was used as the candidate against him in place. So some of these ideas have been prominent. And Joseph remained a very serious political figure for years afterwards, in spite of making that speech. And it's still on the website, where I think it's got a title or something like something to do with the stock of Britain's people or something. It's about exactly what you're describing, how we make the population of Britain have a greater proportion of people from the kind of social classes which will lead to poverty, to intelligence and so forth. So I thought it was really, really interesting. It's possibly not somewhere we want to go today, but because there's many aspects to this debate, but I think there's a part of the assisted dying debate which has some of these issues. I mean, I'm Canadian by birth and family, and some of the way that has gone in Canada in terms of encouraging people to put themselves forward if they feel they're a burden on their family is something which I feel quite uneasy about, although I've heard some people speak very passionately about how they want to manage their own death, and I don't want to completely disregard that at all, because I think that's important to listen to, but I've also got some concerns about some of the things that might come out of that debate.
Anybody else got any questions? Comments?
I liked how you highlighted it, that eugenics and kind of scientific racism wasn't just a Nazi concern, it wasn't just something that the German people did, but it was something that was very common here in the UK and in the USA, and was going on with the talking about sterilisation of Native Americans went on until very, very recently, and the impact of that is still being felt. And there's a famous experiment called Obedience to Authority by Stan Milgram, a psychologist in the States, it's quite an old one now, where he showed when it was an experiment where people were put in a situation where they were told it was a learning by punishment test, and they had to deliver an electric shock to someone if they got the thing wrong. They had to do a memory test, and if they got it wrong, they'd give an electric shock. And at first, they would just listen to a recording, and virtually everybody apparently killed the person. And these were US students in California. And so this was very surprising. So he started bringing the people closer. They could first, then they could see this actor through the window. Then they had to actually take the hand of the person and put it on the thing to give them the electric shock. There was a dial, and it would go into the red zone, danger. And American students, a still proportion, were doing that. They were apparently murdering people. Because this guy in the white coat saying it's not your responsibility, I take full responsibility, you'll ruin the experiment if you stop this. And so the obedience to the authority of the lab coat is not something that Eichmann's excuse about just obeying orders is not something particular to German people, but is very, it is a human trait to extent that.
Why are IQ tests still used so much then when they've kind of been disproved? As someone who does very badly at IQ tests, I've been made to feel like most of my life that I'm substandard, but also I don't care because I worked in an adult training centre when I was younger, and I learned more from people who were, seen as learning disabilities and all of those things. And is it because they want our brains to work in a certain way, like you were saying, to conform to be a certain way? So I don't know why it's still, well, we know why. And I also heard his cornflake speech. I say scumflakes.
Do you want to take just a few minutes literally wrapping up this session?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and wrap up quite quickly. Brilliant contributions. Thank you to everyone. I think there's a really important distinction between sort of eugenics policies and then decisions that people might make, to come to your point, and we'll move quickly on from it, and we could discuss more afterwards, around people having the freedom to choose. And what does the freedom to choose in different contexts really mean? For instance, various screening tests now allow parents to test for conditions of development and in which a child might be born having an impairment, which in our society today would translate to an extremely difficult life. And I think we have to be clear that there's an important distinction between eugenics policies that an elite enforces and coerces and controls a population with an interest in their biological stock, versus the freedom of people to try and navigate how they've got to live, and they've got to bring up, their children, someone they want to nurture and love, into a society that's disabling, into a society that makes life so hard for people. And I think the similar calculations come into the debate around euthanasia. Can we really trust that people are making a free choice, free from coercion around this? I think it is a really serious concern. I think it's relevant, and I think it's important to keep raising it, so thank you. This thing about IQ, that IQ tests still being so popular and still being a bit of fun, is there still that TV show that happens once a year, like the Great British IQ Test? I stopped watching that crap, but when I was growing up, there used to be every year the Great British IQ Test. When I worked briefly overseas in Korea, it's very popular to use the pseudoscientific personality test when you start work, to try and your boss immediately wants to know how you come out on the personality categorization test. This clearly, doesn't it? It comes from an ideology, doesn't it, that we exist to fulfill a very narrow function in order to generate the profits for people who enjoy them, and at our expense live as an elite who are very concerned with our biological qualities. And we're concerned about having a better world for us to raise ourselves and raise the people around us. So eugenic ideas have at their core this idea that, I've written it down here, this idea that you can judge part of society as unfit because there's labour that you can't or you shouldn't bring into the system. It's got a lack of value. You can't do much with the kid who does badly on the IQ test, even if they're a brilliant artist, even if they sing so well, even if they're a chair user, you take them down to the park and they put a smile on everyone's faces that you see because of who they are. And that has absolutely no value to the elite in our system. There's an underlying assumption that you could call the survival of the richest, okay, and the elites are fit to rule, and there's absolutely no alternative. And so they've got a concern with engineering our biological qualities. We've got an interest in ridding the world of that system, in actually opening up the freedom for people who are born with differences or impairments to live a fulfilling life. And we need to, I think, clear out these ideas, these elite ideologies and these predations on us in order to be able to do that. And this is not going to require a preoccupation on biological qualities. We're going to have to make good the social world that we live in, that does so much to shape us and limit us. Let's act in the spirit of those people who rose up to stop the grey buses in T4. Let's honour that. I think you had the idea, Ellen, of taking delegations there for Disability History Month. Wouldn't it be beautiful if we connected Oxfordshire DPAC with our local trades unions and brought people out, got them to fund delegations to go to Absburg, where ordinary people blocked the T4 buses? That's our history, and that's something we've got to take forward into the future.
So finally, I just want to thank everybody who's been involved in this, whether they were a speaker, a technology expert, a getting it organised expert, or just for turning up here today. And keep in touch with us via the website, via WhatsApp, however you do that. One final thing, Pat is going to be coming round with a bag for...
As you go out,
for donations which help fund events like this. Thank you very much.
If anybody wants to